Okay, so I'm a little bit late here on Thursday. I was supposed to do this at 11, but I had forgotten that I had an appointment with the students. So I'm here now and we're doing it, and we're doing it big time. And I have a great presentation for you today that is based on some very interesting work that I did several years ago at when I got into researching the nature of the brain and the mind, and also quantum physics. And this led to a program that I created and an approach that I created called quantum Vedic astrology. And this brings together some of the foundational fundamental principles in Vedic astrology, with the latest in different models of the brain, how the brain actually works, especially what's called the Triune brain and the different structures of our brain, how that brain then creates the world that we live in and inhabit through our different cognitive biases and the way we project our brain into the world. And then how that world is created from our brain and our projections on the quantum level, and how astrology is related to all of these things, or how astrology shows this creation of our mind, and then how our mind creates our world. So I think it's pretty cool. And for those who have gotten my certification course before, for instance, I see that Matthias is here. Matthias Nordemark, who's one of my level 1 course students. These, you already have access to the full course in the Quantum Vedic Astrology course. But I'm going to be going over like an overview of the system today and explaining this quantum Vedic astrology, neuroscience, and quantum physics. Now, I just want to say, I'm not a neuroscientist. I'm not a quantum physicist. And so, that obviously keep all of that in mind. But I will also say that I have had students, well, I have a few students who are literal PhDs and doctors who have studied, they've actually studied quantum physics. They've studied neuroscience, and they say, and I think it's also true, that the explanations that I put forth about these things are really quite spot on. They're really quite good. I'm not just, making up a bunch of terrible, crazy stuff that doesn't make sense. I'm also not going further than I know. One of the best things about, one thing that you should look at with a scholar, so to speak, or you want to judge people's scholarship on whether or not they stick with what they know, or if they start saying a bunch of stuff that they're not really qualified to know. I'm not going to say anything I'm not qualified to know. You'll understand these structures very clearly. Things like the triune brain is a very accepted, structure in how the brain works, the reticular activating system, or the RAS. This isn't anything that isn't accessible to all of us. Also, things like the double-slit experiment, entangled particles, and different structures in quantum physics are things that are studied on a very elementary level. So what I'm doing is I'm bringing astrology into this world so that you can understand how astrology is showing the world on the quantum level. And I'm glad to see this feedback that Matthias gave. He said it was a really great course. One of the first ones I watched was Sam before deciding to go into the level 1 certification. That's right. It's definitely something that is mind shifting, because what it does, and I'll just go on this presentation, is that, these are 3 sciences that function independent of each other, but when we connect them, it's the most sensible structure, because astrology and the astrology chart is what forms your mind. No matter how you look at it, everything that you experience as a person is going to be experienced through your brain first. And again, we can get into what the brain is in the Eastern and Western sense. They're a little different, but it's the heart and the manas and the consciousness that arises from that, spiritual presence. But the brain itself works a certain way. Like we can study a computer, we can study the neural pathways and how the brain works. But again, this is what astrology does. If you want to understand someone's brain, you can look at their astrology chart and see the neuroscience in the different qualities of the astrology chart. And then the neuroscience and the brain and the cognitive biases are what we project out into the world to create something out of nothing. Because on the quantum level, all possibilities exist. But it's not until we interact with the moment that our attention collapses the infinite wave of possibility in the moment into the particle of a specific thing at the exclusion of everything else, right? So this is a very literal process on the quantum level. And again, it sounds very airy-fairy when we talk about it just in a general sense, but when you start to bring something like astrology and quantum physics and neuroscience together, something very specific happens. And, I've seen a lot of Vedic or Indian thinkers who sort of bring these things together a little bit, but I've not seen them make such literal connections as I'm going to make here. They've done it in different ways. It's not to say I'm better or whatever, but this is a literal way. I haven't seen astrologers literally break down the correlations between like the three brains and the energetics of the chart, for example. So this is also a way to bring together the philosophies of the East and the West. So in this sense, the thing to understand is that Eastern and Western approaches need to be integrated if we're going to, understand and feel complete, because Eastern energetics extend what's possible beyond the range of the literal form and matter. And Western, the great thing about Western is that it's experiment. We experiment and we conduct experiments and prove and verify. So the way I say is that Eastern extends what's possible and Western legitimizes through testing and, experimentation. So Western sciences are methodical but incomplete, lacking a connection to spirit and consciousness. Eastern sciences inspire but are stuck because they lack a connection to scrutiny and research, at least in the modern world. People think that yogis just believe in all this stuff, but they don't realize that a yogi, someone who's practicing yoga or Ayurveda or these mystical sciences, they're practices. They do the practices. So states of consciousness are not just beliefs; they're states of awareness that are an experience, just like this is an experience. But if you haven't experienced this, then if you just philosophize about a state of consciousness, it's a belief. But if you've experienced that state of consciousness, you're reporting something factual. And they can look very similar. So this is how these things come together. Deepak Chopra says that if a belief in God can't stand up to proof, it won't sustain a person through difficult times. That's very true. And this is really what is the problem with modern man. And you see Deepak Chopra, for instance, try to explain and rationally explain like the mind of God and the brain as a neuroscientific instrument to people who have never experienced a higher state of consciousness, or as the brain as an interpreter of metaphysical consciousness. Deepak Chopra tries to do this. And I really admire him for it, because he winds up getting his head handed to him from a bunch of neuroscientists who've never experienced a state of consciousness before, of clarity, awareness. And so to them, they just say, oh, that's just woo-woo. And Deepak Chopra says, yeah, you call it woo-woo because you've never experienced it. So you don't know what you're talking about. So on the neuroscientific level, states of consciousness and awareness just sound like woo-woo belief systems. But that's because if you've never experienced that, that's what it is to you. And it just sounds like a lot of religious belief. So again, the two converge, East and West converge at this point where you have the awareness, consciousness, and metaphysics of the East verified in the cauldron and laboratory of the West. So there are a couple things from Parashara that I'll talk about and then get into this a little more. So this is from Brihat Parashara Horosastra. It says Ahamkara is of three classes: sattvic, rajasic, and tamasic. Divine class, sensory organs, and the five primordial compounds. So this is right at the beginning of Brihat Parashara. He talks about the three gunas and the five elements. So they're respectively from the three Ahamkaras. Lord Vishnu, coupled with Sri Shakti, rules over the three worlds. Coupled with Bhu Shakti, he is Brahma, causing the universe. Coupled with Nil Shakti, he is Shiva, destroying the universe. So the Lord is in all beings, and the entire universe is in him. All beings contain both Jiva Atma and Paramatma, so both the separate self and the universal self are in all beings. Some have a predominance of the former, while some have the latter in predominance. Brahma, Shiva, and others, their powers or consorts too, have a predominance of Paramatmans and others more Jiva Atmans. So it means that different beings, which include the planets, by the way, the planets are a class of beings as well. And the planets are in the group of beings called the Paramatmans, or the supreme self of beings, in a general sense. That's a general way to look at it. There are also categories within them, but this is why the planets have also descended as avatars of Lord Vishnu, like Rama as the sun, Krishna as the moon. They're directly connected, or emanations of Lord Vishnu. That's what the planets are, right? But here he's talking about how Ahamkara, or the inner instrument, the inner being, is composed of three, has three classes: sattva, rajas, and tamas, and five elements. Now this is a illustration. I believe it comes from Dr. Vasant Lad's book that talks about Purusha Prakriti, which is sun and moon. Mahat is divine intelligence. Ahamkar, like you said, Ahamkar is of three classes: tamas, rajas, and sattva. So as soon as cosmic intelligence separates into individuation, which is Ahamkara, it breaks out into three qualities of nature, and then there are five sense organs and elements over here, and then organs of action and organs of wisdom over here. So this is the foundation of what's called Sankhya philosophy, the philosophy of astrology, of yoga, and of Ayurveda. But you see that's right in the Vedic astrology text. And then it says, Maitreya, the incarnations of Vishnu, Sri Ram, Sri Krishna, are they endowed with jiva? And he says, Parashara says, the four incarnations, Rama, Krishna, Narasimha, are holy Paramatmans. Others are mixed with Jiva Atmans too. So certain emanations of the planets or of Vishnu are full Paramatmans, others are mixed. But the important thing is, he says, or one of the most important things he says, is that the unborn Lord has many incarnations. And again, incarnation is not the great word, because we incarnate due to karma. They actually emanate through spirit as an avatar. So he's emanated as the 9 planets, 9 grahas, to bestow on the living beings the results due to their karmas. He is Janardhan. He assumed the auspicious form of grahas to destroy the demons and sustain the divine beings. So Janardhan is the one who destroys Janma, or birth, brought about by avidya, or ignorance, and bestows on the worshiper the awareness of his identity with the Lord. So Lord Vishnu has come forth as the 9 planets to bestow on the living beings the fruits of their actions. He is Janardhan. He assumed the auspicious form of grahas, or planets, to destroy the demons and sustain the divine beings. So the universe itself is the appearance of Lord Vishnu, and his energy is broken out into these 9 grahas to dispense our karma, so that we can awaken from the illusion of separate birth, the illusion of birth. Then he says, after completing the mission, the Paramatmans again merge in their planets, which means Rama merges back into the sun, Krishna merges back into the moon. The Jivatma portions from the grahas take birth as human beings and live their lives according to their karmas and again merge in the planets. So you as a human being live your life according to your karmas, and then you again merge back into the planets, merge back into the grahas. At the time of the Great Destruction, the grahas again merge in Lord Vishnu. So at some point, all of this will be over, and the grahas themselves will merge back into Lord Vishnu. The one who knows these will become versed in the knowledge of the past, present, future. Without a knowledge of Jyotish, these cannot be known. So Jyotish is the study of these things I'm talking about, so that you can understand the cosmic order. That's why my main mission in life is to teach, to make sure to teach it properly and correctly, because without a knowledge of this, this can't be known. Hence, everyone should have a knowledge of Jyotish, particularly the Brahmin. And he's basically referring as a Brahmin to what we would call educated people. The Brahmins were the ones that were educated about life, educated about the sort of meaning and purpose of life. And so once you become educated, you think you have a clue, you have knowledge, or you think you have knowledge about how it all works. So this is why without a knowledge of Jyotish, you really can't know that. So the one devoid of knowledge of Jyotish blames this Vedic science, will go to the hell called Raurava and be reborn blind. So again, what happens is if you are educated and you think you have a clue about it, but you really don't, you wind up sort of living as if you're blind, like grasping for meaning and grasping for light, trying to understand why you're here, right? This is why we should study Jyotish according to the Vedic tradition. And that's why we try to keep it real and try to make sure that the teachings are correct and that we don't just make things up or, just sort of get it wrong. And so in chapter 3, at the very beginning, again, this is before he even starts talking about charts, how to do charts. Parashara does give a clear explanation, as is the case in all texts, as in most authoritative texts, as he lays out the structure. So then Maitreya asked him, kindly give the detail of the planetary characters and dispositions. He just told you Lord Vishnu was the planets. Listen on account of listen to the account of placements of the heavenly bodies. Out of the many luminous bodies and lights in the sky, some are stars, some are planets. So those that have no movements are the nakshatras. So he's saying when you look in the sky, there's a bunch of lights. Some of them don't move. They're called nakshatras. Those are grahas that move through the nakshatras in the zodiac. So there are some lights that are called planets or grahas that are moving. Others are stationary. They're called nakshatras. And then it says the said zodiac comprises of 27 nakshatras commencing from Ashwini. The same area is divided in 12 parts equal to 12 rashis commencing from Mesha. So here right at the beginning of Parashara, he says 27 nakshatras and 12 signs occupying the same area divided. Okay, so it's pretty clear that he's pinning the sidereal sky, the rashis, to the nakshatras. This is in the other Vedic astrology text as well. And then he says the names of the grahas commence from Surya. The rashi is known as Lagna. The rashi rising is known as Lagna. So based on Lagna and the grahas joining and departing from each other, the natives' good and bad effects are deducted. So it's pretty clear. Again, right there, he just gives a simple paragraph. There are lights in the sky. Some, most aren't moving. They're called nakshatras. There are some that moving called grahas. That area is divided in 27 nakshatras and 12 rashis commencing from Mesha, right? And commencing from Ashwini. So he's telling you where they begin and that they're the same point. And it's really quite clear. It's the same thing in the other statements as well. So this shows the sidereal zodiac. And then he says, based on the planets, the rashi rising is known as Lagna or intersecting point. Based on the Lagna and the grahas joining and departing from each other, the natives' good and bad effects are deduced. So again, you read the chart from the Lagna. This is also why I read everything from the Lagna, including transits. I don't read it from the moon. It's from the Lagna. That's the good and bad effects, okay? So let me take a little drink of water here. Looks like we got some people in here. I see Lynette Sue Crawl. Nice to see Lynette Sue Crawl and other folks who've studied with me before. So now we get back to this. We're going to, focus on some principles. So when we focus on principles, that allows us to connect systems to each other. This is really important. If you're just focusing on the details of systems, of different systems, then it seems like they have nothing to do with each other. Again, so too often we focus on the methods of a specific system rather than the universal principles which make all systems work. So principle thinking is supreme. So here are a few principles. Gravity, that's a principle. In every science, it's a principle. Heat and cold, temperature, and their effect on matter. This is universal. Doesn't matter what else you're doing scientifically. When you get into Indian ideas, or at least what we would call Indian, these are still universal principles. Dharma, which is the highest truth, what we know to be right. Karma, which are actions that we take and their results. Now, maybe it's only India that puts a focus on Dharma and karma, but they're universal principles. Your actions have a result, period. That's karma. There's a right approach to things. And when you do things that are congruent with the truth, either of who you are or the universal law, it feels good and it supports itself and leads to wisdom. That's a higher truth. Just because it has a Sanskrit word to it doesn't mean it isn't a universal truth. It's still a universal truth. So gunas, which again, this is a universal truth. Some, like in the West, we call it body, mind, spirit, self, others, universe. Again, tamas, rajas, sattva. It's a universal framework. 5 elements. These are building blocks of life. They're universal. Even in Western alchemy, especially when you go back into Greek, to Greece, they had the humors that they used in medicine and their healing, which is very similar to Ayurveda. And then there's also dualities, inner, outer, action versus feeling, masculine, feminine. These are universal frameworks. So when we look at that level of frameworks, then we can connect systems like Vedic astrology and neuroscience or quantum physics or whatever, because they're all operating in accordance with universal principles. So instead of focusing over, well, Dharma is a Sanskrit word, it's an Eastern concept that has no relevance, that's just simply not true, okay? Again, sometimes we have to dig a little bit to match the frameworks up, but that's the way, this is how you can approach matching up something like Vedic astrology with neuroscience. You look and see, where do the universal principles converge, right? So here's a principle that's explained. Karma means action, the law that includes predeterminism and presence. They're part of the same process, just viewed from a different point. So for an example, if you drink 10 cups of coffee, it will predetermine the hyperactivity that follows. Once you take that action, you cannot change that result, right? The example in Vedic wisdom is also the arrow. Once you shoot the arrow, you can't get it back, right? Once you drink the 10 cups of coffee, you're going to have to deal with it, right? So when we're born, we've already shot a lot of arrows. So your life, as you've incarnated, is basically, when you're looking at the chart, you're looking at a lot of arrows that have been shot into existence. And you can't change a certain trajectory. They're going to land. You know, you've already drank the 10 cups of coffee or whatever it is, right? And when you look at the chart, you're looking at all of that potential, right? And where those arrows are going to land based on timing and whatnot. So all karma works this way. But because with a lot of karma, there's a gap between the action and the result, we might forget, right? So for example, we don't remember our past lives. We don't remember all of that. We don't really know what it is, but we have a certain way of seeing the world. That's the aggregate of all those lives. But even in this lifetime, we don't need to look into past lives to understand why it's easy to forget karma. For example, let's say even in this lifetime, there's a lot of things that we forgot, but they happened. You know, let's say you steal something and you don't get caught. Then one day someone steals something from you. There might be a feeling of being victimized, but actually this was karma teaching you what it's like to steal, right? We might have forgotten that thing that we stole, and then someone steals from us and we're like, oh, that's so unfair. Well, it's not unfair. Something is being balanced, even though we might not remember it or we might not want to remember it. So when we remember the truth that we're not just living this lifetime with these circumstances, it's easy to see how our current birth situations and life challenges came from the decisions and actions from the past. Then each moment, as these patterns arise, we're challenged to choose more wisely or continue to bring more difficulty. So it's really not that hard to even see how your past life karma shows up in this lifetime. Because a person who maybe stole a lot in their lifetime, they're going to have a tendency to steal a bit in this lifetime. And hopefully, though, they're finishing the karma with stealing, and they'll get caught and they'll be shamed and they'll learn and they'll outgrow it. I use this example because I had it happen to me. Very interesting, just a quick story. When I was in high school, I never stole hardly at all. The only thing I ever stole was there was a back in the day, they used to sell cassette tapes at this place near where I used to work when I was in high school. And I loved cassette tapes, I loved music, and it was so easy to steal them because nobody watched, and the store had all these blind spots. It was so easy to steal cassette tapes. Plus, I didn't have a lot of money. So the only time I ever got into stealing was when I was literally a senior in high school, and I stole a bunch of cassette tapes because, I love music and I wanted to play them. And I had all these cassette tapes, and I also played in a band. About 2 years after high school, when I started playing in nightclubs, we had a guy who helped our band. And one night we had a gig, we had a place where we played. And after that gig, after I unloaded all of my equipment, I noticed all my cassette tapes were stolen. And my friend said, oh, you didn't invite, you had Clayton with you. Clayton stole them. Clayton's a thief. He steals. And see, I didn't realize that this guy, his name was Clayton, stole things. And at first I was like, God, I can't believe he stole all my tapes. And I was like, well, actually, I stole them. He stole my stolen tapes. It didn't take long for me to go, okay. Now, I don't steal anyway, and I never really got into stealing. That was the only, that was the only time I ever stole in my life. But it was very clear that, okay, I couldn't really cry about it too much because the tapes I had stolen were stolen from me. And I quickly went, okay, I guess that makes sense. So here's a universal principle that really has a lot to do, especially with the neuroscience and the brain. So the gunas, as you saw, Parashara explains the gunas. So body, mind, and spirit are tamas, rajas, and sattva. So tamas is body or form. Tamas binds us. It's the guna that binds us through inertia and our tendency to cling to situation and form. Its power is best expressed through the body and physical forms, and it's where we have to put an emphasis on ourself. So with the tamasic guna, these are things we need to handle ourselves. I'll talk about that more in a second. But we're supposed to handle the tamasic stuff ourselves. Instead, we throw it on people because it's hard to hold. Anger, fear, stress, worry. We're supposed to manage that ourselves. This is the highest way to understand tamasic guna. We should handle it ourselves. Mainly Mars, Saturn, and Rahu, Ketu energy are energies we're supposed to manage, but instead we dump them. Rajas is mind or activity. Rajas binds us through motivation and our desire to experience pleasure. And it shows the mind and emotions, and it puts an emphasis on other people. So Rajas is very much about the desires of the world, especially the desire to interact with other people, to experience pleasure with them, and to give pleasure to them. I get some, you get some. I get some, you get some, right? This is things we must share equally. Rajas shows where we're trying to share things equally, and it's related to the mind and emotions. Mind is very rajasic, this, that, this, that. Again, we're supposed to share. What we tend to do with the rajasic planets, which are Venus and Mercury, is, again, we want to keep that for ourselves. But instead, we need to share it. So one of the things we can learn about Venus and Mercury energy is we need to share it. We need to listen as much as we talk with Mercury. We need to give happiness as much as get happiness, which is Venus. Okay? Sharing, equality. And that's what these two planets are about. They're about equality, always. You said that, I said that. You give this, I give that. I gave this, but you didn't give that. That's what Rajas is about. That's what we learn in romantic relationships and other relationships with others more than anything else. And then sattva is related to spirit and harmony. And sattva binds us to happiness and wisdom, which is also a barrier to final liberation, as it's the soul and it connects us to God. And these are things we must give selflessly. This is what we want to give selflessly. It's actually what we're trying to do, right? So the sun is where we just want to share our light and power. And it's also where we sacrifice, like a father will sacrifice his power for his family and feels good doing it. Mother will sacrifice her happiness and emotional state for her family and kids. Jupiter is where teachers and gurus sacrifice for students, or where we're looking for the higher purpose and meaning. And again, this is where we have to give selflessly in those things. Again, we tend to be selfish, and we want to keep a lot of that sattva for ourselves too. I want to be inspired. I want the inspiration for me. I want the goodness for me. And we must give selflessly the sattva. We must share the rajas, and we're supposed to keep the tamas to ourselves. You're supposed to keep your fear and anger and stress and worry and pressure and confusion to yourself and work through it. Instead, we work through it by dumping a lot of that onto other people and wanting them to still give us happiness and pleasure while we're dumping our fear and anger on them, but make me happy still. So a lot can be learned. This is a whole class in itself, is on the gunas and the planets. So here's how the planets relate to the gunas. Sun is power, sattvic. Moon is connection, sattvic. Mars is strength, which is tamasic. Inner strength first. Mercury is intelligence, which is rajasic. Jupiter is wisdom, which is sattvic. Venus is happiness, which is rajasic. And Saturn is control, which is tamasic. So again, you could put things like, sharing power, sharing connection, developing personal strength. Or, this would be giving power, I should say, giving connection, developing personal strength, sharing intelligence, giving wisdom, sharing personal happiness, developing self-control. So I sort of put a little adjective before, or a little qualifying, I guess it's a, whatever it is, statement before to connect it with the guna. So because this is a selfless one, it's giving power to others or empowering others, giving connection and love. And because this is tamasic, we need to develop personal strength. Saturn, develop personal control. This is the way we're supposed to do it. We're supposed to develop it ourselves rather than feel strong while I'm making you feel weak or trying to control you, right? This is sharing intelligence, sharing happiness, because it's rajasic, right? And so the the signs also have a guna, right? Aries is rajasic, Taurus is rajasic, Gemini is rajasic. Notice the first three signs are rajasic. They're starting a lot of activity and energy. Then the next two are sattvic, Cancer sattvic, Leo sattvic. The first tamasic sign doesn't come until Virgo. That's the first tamasic sign. Organizing all of the structure, organizing all of the rajas and sattva. Virgo says, I got to organize all this. Then we get another rajasic. Then Scorpio is tamasic, Sagittarius sattvic, tamasic, tamasic, sattvic. So the last four signs, Sagittarius, Capricorn, Aquarius, Pisces, are two sattvic and two tamasic in the middle, right? So again, you see how the end of life, if you look at the zodiac even as a metaphor or as a mandala of the soul's evolution, a lot of rajas at first, because at least when we incarnate, a lot of rajas, which is activity mixed with some wisdom, hopefully, then trying to organize the structure. That's the first six signs. First six signs are mainly rajasic, two sattvic, and one tamasic. That's half the zodiac signs. Then the last six, only one is rajasic. The rest are tamasic and sattvic. And the last four, two of them are sattvic. So two of the last four, this is where the sattva, which is now we're trying to really connect with higher purposes and manage all of that darkness and fear. So if you look at the zodiac even just as a mandala of gunas and energetic, unfolding, especially if you break it up into quadrants, if you break it up into three groups of four, you notice that the last four again, from Sagittarius to from Sagittarius to Pisces, Sattvic, Tamasic, Tamasic, Sattvic. So the last third of life, even if you want to, look at it that way, is really once we get older, we're trying to manage death and stay hopeful and connect to higher purpose. This is all Saturn, Jupiter stuff. This is where we go from Sagittarius, Capricorn, Aquarius, Pisces. So these things, again, I'm really talking about Guna on this level because it's very powerful. It's a primordial force. Again, the reason I went back and made the quotes from Parashara is so you can see this is right from the Rishi himself. And we're connecting 3 gunas and 5 elements in Jyotish. Again, it's a universal principle because it's also in Ayurveda and yoga. It's a framework. It's a universal framework, the gunas. We can see how in the neuroscience, we see the same 3 brains. It's called the triune brain. And basically, as we have evolved, our brains have evolved. And first, when we were more like a reptile kind of creature, we have a lizard brain, which the reptile brain, which is related to protection, survival, heartbeat. And so these 3 brains are generally speaking at odds with each other. They're different motivations. The reptile brain is oriented towards protection, survival, heartbeat. The mammal brain is related to nurturing, connection, being communal. And the human brain, which is related to concepts, abstractions, beliefs. Again, you can see a direct correlation to the gunas here. Reptile brain, tamasic, mammal brain, rajasic, human brain, sattvic. And again, we also want to understand that all brains aren't created equal, at least in our world. This is why we tend to dump and really struggle a lot with the tamasic because it's fearful. And we're trying to survive first. Research has shown that we're up to 200% more motivated to avoid pain than we are to experience pleasure. And the inner reptile and ape are much more powerful than we imagine. They're sort of like our puppeteers. So again, because the part of our mind that conceptualizes and that thinks into the future and that looks into what could be possible, that part of our brain, that human brain, is literally like the sattvic brain. We tend to think that that's what's in control. We tend to think that we're, again, I don't want to be insulting, but we tend to think that we're wise and intelligent and, thoughtful and rational. And frankly, we're hardly any of those things. Once in a while we think, but we're usually very triggered and reactionary and really being controlled, because if we were really motivated by those things, we'd actually do what was intelligent and thoughtful all the time. Instead, we wind up in all this negative programming, which I'm going to talk about, and it's really the reptile brains and mammal brains interfering with the higher brains. And instead of following that inspired purpose and that openness, we wind up being afraid to do it. Well, we've got to be careful. We might not have enough money, or we might, make enemies. Somebody might kill us, or we have these primal fears everywhere instead of living in accordance with that higher wisdom, even things that we know are true. It's hard to break out of it because of this deep inner reptile and mammal program. So again, the reptile brain is patterned towards survival. And the planets that legislate and rule that reptile brain are Saturn, which is fear and control, and Mars, which is anger and discipline. So fear on a really lower level, and control and self-mastery on a higher level, managing and facing our fear. Mars is anger and frustration, fight or flight. That's the reptile brain. Fight, which is Mars, flee, which is Saturn. In the highest sense, that anger of Mars becomes discipline in the highest sense. And that discipline is that willingness to face the unpleasantness and difficulty and stress. This is how we manage tamasic energy. We have to be willing to face that hardship and unpleasantness and keep it to ourselves. Face that fear ourselves. When we face the fear, we connect with that which is fearless and deathless. When we face our anger and frustration, it becomes very disciplined. And true courage is realized. But it's hard to sit with it. And it's hard to be unpleasant, mainly because we also have a mammal brain, which wants to be happy, wants to find something interesting to think about, to look at, somebody to interact with. It's much more pleasant to leave that reptile brain, which is very challenging and hard. Facing our fear and being disciplined is very hard. Instead, I'll find this thing. This is fun. This is enjoyable. This is amusing. I'll eat a piece of chocolate. I'll talk to this person. I'll get in some kind of thing. I'll get into some kind of drama with another person. That's what we usually do. Our whole life is spent mainly a lot in this mammal brain interacting with other people, right? Venus and Mercury have to do with that. Venus, happiness. Mercury, details, stimulation. And then the human brain, which is about evolution. Sun, which is the power of the self, the true self, to share. Moon is the power of love, to connect and nurture. Again, these are selfless. This is why nothing feels better than sharing the thing you love, like I'm doing right now. I love it. You know, we all would hope that people enjoy sharing the thing that we want to share. It lights us up and we give our power. We just want to give our power away and hope that people want it. Power of love, right? Love is pure love is selfless. Like the love for pets and children, part of us just wants to give love with nothing in return, right? That's sattvic. And, you know, Jupiter, higher meaning and purpose. We just want to connect with meaning and we want to share what's meaningful to us. This is also why great teachers, if a teacher, you know, wants to extract something from you, and no, I don't mean something like payment for a class, but I mean, if they try to take advantage of the vulnerability there, then they're not a good teacher, right? And so again, this is also parent-child roles, right? Where children, where we believe in our teachers and we want them to be pure. So teachings need to be pure, and we just want to give those teachings. Again, these are the motivations. So we have a lot of inner conflicts because these brains are not in alignment. So for example, let me jump down here to a chart. If we look at this neuroscience through the three brains, and when we're looking at an astrology chart, we're actually looking at the brains, right? This person is a Libra rising, which is Rajasic. So they have a Sattvic planet in the first house, aspected by a Tamasic planet, right? They have Moon and Mercury, which are feelings, feelings by nature are Sattvic. We want to have feelings of goodness, and our feelings are mainly from a place of love. Even when the reason it's so complicated with our feelings and emotions is because pure love is the source of all emotion. But we have a lot of different emotions that come from different planets. Like some people we're afraid of, some people we don't like because they're mean to us. But that doesn't affect it on the deepest level. We are still pure love. Even the people we hate, we love. And we don't want to hate them, but we do, because we're afraid of them because of fear and other gunas interfering. This is exactly what I'm talking about. This creates inner conflict. So instead of connecting to pure love, we get off on emotions. In this case, this person's emotion has a lot to do with Rajasic, because now you see the mammal mind, the Rajasic mind, interfering or interacting with the thoughts. And you also have the thoughts and the purity of thought, which just wants to blend everything the purity of feeling just wants to blend everything together, whereas thoughts and Mercury wants to make everything distinct. So this is how you see an inner conflict around thoughts and feelings, how when this person speaks, it gets confused with their feelings. That's trying to integrate everything, but speech is about being clear. When they try to feel something, there's a lot of ideas saying, but what about this? What about this? How about that? So they interrupt each other. And it's an interruption on the gunas and of the brains, of the triune brain, right? Because Mercury is that mammal brain. It's very much about rajas and interchange and equality. Mercury, you said this, I said this. I get that, you get that. That's very much what the Rajasic planets are about. Sattvic planets aren't. They're like, I love you. I want to give love. I don't need anything in return. I don't want anything in return. So again, when you see that Mercury moon conjunction, it's these two brains in conflict. It's the mammal brain saying, but there needs to be equality, and the human brain of higher love and unity consciousness, which is the highest quality of the moon, saying, but I don't see any distinction. So there's an inner conflict that comes about simultaneously to wanting to connect with that unity consciousness. There's distinction, ideas, thoughts. What about this? Dialogue. What happens is the two get confused. Feelings become thoughts. Thoughts become feelings. Emotional thinking and interpretive feeling, right? They kind of get mixed. So again, these brains are really quite in conflict with each other. They have very distinct purposes. Reptile brain is to keep us alive. Mammal brain is to keep us connected with others. And human brain is to evolve. So I wanted to show a chart first, but there's a couple examples of how these brains work and how the reptile brain is much more in control. So example one, we can have a challenge in our personal growth. So let's say that you want to do more fulfilling work, like you want to be an astrologer or a counselor, but your friends and family think you're a little kooky. There she is, all that weird astrology stuff. They see you in a certain way. Oh yeah, that's just Janet. Janet, she's always been that person with those kooky ideas, but she's really a mother raising her kids. Come on, Janet, just calm down, right? So they see you in a certain way, your family, they're not used to seeing you as some counselor or astrologer, even though in your mind, your sattvic mind, you envision this thing, right? They see you a certain way. By the way, that's the mammal brain, the people around you. You want everybody to like you, especially your family, your loved ones. And then on a deeper level, there's fear that, you won't be able to support yourself or make enough money to survive if you pursue this dream of being an astrologer or a counselor or something more. So you stay stuck. You stay stuck in it, and it just remains this dream. Again, this dream. This is the difficulty of the sattvic state. So you can't judge these gunas. They're all perfect for what they show. We're supposed to use the sattvic guna when we're supposed to use it. We're still going to use it, but we're often going to use it in a way that's not the way it's supposed to be used. It's often this dream we have, this fairy tale dream we have that one day something might happen because we're imagining it, which again, mammals, dogs and cats and other mammals, they're not imagining doing something. They're in their identity as a mammal. Certainly reptiles aren't either, but we are. We can imagine other things, but we're still stuck in our mammal reptile world. But you got to have enough money, got to be practical. And we say things like practical, but we're also deeply inhibited by what everybody around us is going to say. Because these are the people, again, and so instead of really facing ourselves and learning about the truth of who we are, working through our fears and anger and all that stuff, we go out into the world with other people and our identity comes back from them. And so we want their approval. So example 2 of a 3-brain conflict, role playing. So like interactions with others necessitates that we play many roles, often simultaneously. This confuses us as the 3 brains have different needs and motivation. So again, our interactions show a lot of brains in conflict. For example, the parent-child relationship is an evolving relationship. Everything is evolving. So when the child is really small, the interaction with the child is that selfless love interaction, right? It's that selfless love when the child is really small. We just nurture them. We just take care of them selflessly. We don't ask for anything in return. That's the sattva guna, right? But then as the child grows and starts to understand different value systems, and we see in their behavior that they're starting to develop their own identity, then we start interacting with them more on the mammal level, right? It's not that sattvic level of selfless love and nurturing. Now it's a rajasic level of 2 equals eventually getting along. This is why, even though most of our parents suckled us and nurtured us to their best of ability when we were helpless, but we don't always get along with them as an adult because that's a different relationship. We're not their little baby anymore who is helpless. So this is why the best way I often use to illustrate the selfless love relationship is actually the actually having pets, because we're always selflessly loving and nurturing pets, even if they poop on the floor or whatever. But our relationship with our children or our parents change over time. Some people have very complicated relationships with children. It's not this selfless love, but there's still that nurturing quality that's always there. Not always, but usually. So again, this is an example of how roles change over time. And just want to say, for example, this is part, what I'm talking about is part of a larger course. I'm just going to put a link here real quick because some people might want to know. This is part of a course that you can get. In fact, Matthias already spoke about how he already looked at this, how he already looked at this course. You can actually get this great bonus that I have, this Quantum Vedic Astrology bundle. You also get a bunch of bonuses and all kinds of stuff that you can get, really a ridiculous value that you can also get if you're interested. But anyway, I just wanted to put that in there as well. But let's get back to the presentation. So again, that parent-child relationship is one that's always changing. So again, this is how we have to navigate those three brains. And we see the conflict because the parent always wants to nurture the child. But then as a child grows up, the parent realizes that the child is now kind of an adult and they're testing their boundaries. And the child has a sophisticated enough intelligence that they realize that they're hurting your feelings. They realize they're being mean. Again, once we understand that the individual is accountable and that they have an ego and they have this kind of relationship, then the mammal brain, the Rajasic brain, comes in. And literally you can say that the Rajasic brain of Mercury and Venus is how we navigate each other's egos. So as the child develops an ego and they interact with our ego, then the parent-child relationship evolves from a sattvic to a Rajasic relationship and has to be navigated. So we also have boss-employee relationships, right? It's a tricky interaction, and it changes and evolves and has to go in between different things, because a good boss isn't just an overlord. The boss empowers the worker at best, right? Which is very much sattvic. It's very much sattvic to want them to be empowered, but again, a good boss also treats the person like an equal, right? But the good boss also has to have the authority to be able to bring the hammer down and say, but I'm the one in charge. I'm the one that could fire you or whatever. So again, it's very subtle. We have to kind of weave in and out of these. And again, these are the inner conflicts and the confusion that can be clearly understood by a conflict of the brains, okay? And by the way, this is how neuroscience basically explains all of this stuff. Again, I'm doing it on a very general level, on a very rudimentary level, but this is how neuroscience would explain this as well. Well, your higher brain is the part of your brain that takes care of your child, but then as your child grows, it's more of the mammal brain so it's the same thing a neuroscientist would say. It's a conflict of the brains, right? I say the same thing, but astrology gives us an extremely accurate portrayal of exactly how it's happening. So it even extends neuroscience. I have things at my disposal that no neuroscientist has. I'm not just listening to them say stuff or just approaching them through some kind of template. I'm actually, when I look at an astrology chart, I'm looking at their brains. I'm looking at how their human, mammal, and reptile brains are functioning, how they're working together. I can see it literally. Again, this is why it's so crucial also to get outside of astrology, learn the principles of astrology really well, but then start looking at other sciences and start matching up the structures. This is what I've done a lot of. I've done a lot of this. This is why I wrote a book on yoga and Vedic astrology, right? To connect it, because they're connected. And if you're talking about universal truths and authentic sciences, they're going to match up. And they're going to match up on the level of principles and frameworks, like I said at the beginning. right? So if it's an authentic science, it's going to match up with every other authentic science. If it's not, if it's pseudoscience, it's not going to match up, okay? So now this is important. Change only happens when all three brains are involved. Nothing changes if it's just stuck in some brain. And again, this is called compartmentalizing. So we compartmentalize experiences in different parts of the brain, and we wind up in conflict. The part of you that dreams about something more, the part of you that wants to make sure that your family still approves, the part of you that's afraid that if you do make a change, that you'll wind up not having enough money. And by the way, there's also the fear that if everybody in your life rejects you, that you'll wind up dead. Because ape societies and other mammal societies, the worst thing is to be ostracized from the group, because the group depends on each other for food, for partnership, for everything. So your mammal brain is also terrified of being ostracized. That's also part of the reptile brain. It's not being ostracized is the mammal brain, but the fear of death, if you get ostracized, is the reptile brain, because the reptile brain is fear and anger. So you do anything. Look, public speaking is the biggest fear people have. Why? Because they're afraid they're going to make an ass of themselves and everybody will hate them and everybody will laugh at them, because there's an understanding, a primal fear that if everybody thinks I'm an idiot, maybe no one will love me, I won't eat, and I'll die. Maybe they'll even kill me, because these have happened in the mammal brain and in the reptile brain. So these things are no joke. There's a reason why the reptile is much more powerful. It should be, because you need to make sure to survive first. However, we approach it very irrationally now. Usually, the things that are threats to our survival are not actual threats. They're perceived threats. It's just part of our ego. So change only happens when all three brains are involved. So when the conceptual human connects with the pleasurable mammal and the visceral reptile brain, things change. But we have to work from the bottom up to affect change in our life. We must handle our inner reptile first and stop inflicting him on people. Once we handle our inner reptile and manage our own fear and anger and become disciplined and courageous, we can bypass the second one. That's the good news, because think about it. Let's say that you have ideas of being an astrologer or some counselor or something more, whatever it is that you want more in your life, but you're looking and you understand how as soon as you start to grow and develop a little bit, all the people around you start to resist and start saying, oh, come on, that's a little crazy, how much that kind of bugs you. But the real reason you don't do it is because you think, I might not be able to support myself or might not have enough money. Or if you could get that handled, you would do it and just give your middle finger to the rest of the people. Admit it. That's the way most of us are. If we know that we're going to survive, or that we can survive the big changes, we'll just do it and kind of say, look, you guys just have to deal with it. This is who I am. This is what I'm doing. And I'm going to make it on my own. So especially we need to handle that inner reptile first, right? So I talked about that, and so I already jumped to the astrology chart, and we looked at one example, right? Moon, Mercury, feelings and thoughts interacting, right? Sun, Venus, true power with desire, right? She's got Sun, Venus conjunction, right? Which is the true power of the sun, sattvic energy, wanting to empower, but Venus, which is personal desire. I want to be happy and I want to share it with others. So again, they're in conflict with each other. Every planetary conjunction pretty much has some, not every, but most of them, many of them have these inner conflicts there. And again, this is one of the things you want to really look for. This is why some conjunctions are really quite beneficial to that part, like Mercury-Venus conjunction. They're both Rajasic, but you might get them in a Tamasic sign as well. And then it's going to bring out the Tamasic quality and bring that naturally curious and egalitarian nature into something that's more stressful. Or they might be in a Sattvic sign, which makes them more sort of airy-fairy and future. You want things to be in their appropriate guna as much as possible. That's the preferred. Again, that's the ideal state. What you wind up doing in astrology is explaining what is and dignifying what is, right? So in this case, like that moon Mercury, we have all three gunas because they're in a tamasic sign. So this conflict between thoughts and feelings, I say it's a conflict, there's also a strength. It helps to integrate those ideas, so they're very synthetic, and it helps the person try to put their feelings into words. But again, it can also be an interruption, and they're in a tamasic sign. Saturn ruled Capricorn, so underneath it all, it's quite serious. And these feelings and thoughts and ideas and this kind of swirl winds up being focused on things that might be kind of dark and scary, and where, you know, there's a lot of boundaries, you know, a lot of boundary issues where you don't let very many in, but the ones you do let in, you go really far with, those kinds of things. So this is how you bring together those gunas, and you're talking about the brains. And again, the boundaries and is related to the reptile, especially Saturn reptile is boundaries, right? Mars reptile is breaking down boundaries. This is why Saturn and Mars have this energy. So again, Saturn, Jupiter, hope and fear, right? Now again, you want to understand something. Where we always future pace with our sattvic planets, but many times the thing we imagine, which is Jupiter and sattvic planets, the things we imagine are things that are fearful. This is how sattva and tamas interrupt. This is how tamas interrupts sattva, especially. Because then the thing we imagine is something dark and fearful and scary, especially when it's Saturn. And this is especially how Saturn interrupts Jupiter. And in this case, neither dignity is that good either. Okay, so the dignities aren't so good either. Now, Jupiter also can help Saturn, because Saturn is this negative, uh-oh, everything is scary, and Jupiter says, no, you can learn this. There's this hopeful thing, this hopeful teaching that's also there. So again, you have to talk about both. They're mutual influence. You don't pick the bad one and say it's hurting the good one. No, you don't just do it this way. It goes both ways. You have to make it, you know, make it a sharing. This kind of aspect is a sharing. These conjunctions are sharings. Some aspects are one way, but these are a sharing. So these are some ideas about how the brain is formed on the level of the chart. Now, what happens is then this chart mixture, this mixture of the chart that we have creating this mind, then creates what's called the RAS, the reticular activating system. So what happens is the RAS takes that aggregate of attention and focuses it and you know, shows how we see the world based on the interplay of these three brains, of these three gunas. The world you see is your projection. You're projecting yourself into all situations. You see the world the way you see it. In a very neutral way, the world is just ready to be perceived, and it's being perceived by everyone differently. Same situation, different mind, different world. And this is called reticular activating system. So what happens is we form beliefs based on what we've experienced. We've experienced things, it creates a belief. And again, when we're looking at this chart, we could also break it down to these are a bunch of beliefs. These are entrenched beliefs. We talk about the behavior, but it's also what the person believes. I believe thoughts and feelings are almost the same. It's all just kind of the same thing, and you got to be careful because people are going to get you or something, you know. And then Sun, Venus. I like to share my power, but it has to be beautiful. Come back to me as well. But you can't just give all your power away. You need to get some for yourself. Blah, blah, blah. These are all beliefs. If you start talking to the person, you'll hear how that chart and those configurations form all of these beliefs, right? We see what we're looking for and negate everything else. Again, this is really important. We filter situations through this perspective. And imagination is real in the RAS, in the reticular activating system. What you imagine is real in the RAS, meaning the life you imagine for yourself that's going to play out one day if you take a chance might as well be the real thing, because you wind up creating it. It's real in your mind. When you have a fear of something, there's no difference physiologically to an imagined fear and a real fear, even in severity. and certainty. If you're totally certain that this thing's going to happen, you respond as if it totally already happened, as if there's a snake about to bite you. You react it might be just as real, but it might be totally an imagination. But in your mind and in your in your neurochemistry, it's just as real based on the severity. So this is why there's a great story in Indian literature about the snake and the rope. If we're walking on a dimly lit path in the middle of the night, we can see a rope laid along our path. And if we can't see very clearly and there's just a little bit of moonlight, we might mistake that rope to be a snake. And so what we do is we jump back because we think we've seen a snake. And our entire physiology reacts to the snake. To our mind, to our RAS, to our projection, it's a snake. There's no difference between if it actually was a snake or if it's an imagined snake. So then when we produce a flashlight and shine the light on the rope, we realize, oh, it was just a rope. And that changes us. We don't then go back and forget. The story has a lot of purposes. One of them is this RAS, that we can completely get it wrong and just project something that's totally not true, but it might as well be true because we live as if it's true. It's absolutely true on our nervous system. The other thing is once you produce the flashlight and realize it's a rope, you don't then go back to forgetting after you turn the flashlight off and then jump back again as if it was a snake again. Some people do, but they might have a mental impairment. But once you experience the truth, you don't forget it again. You don't forget, oh, that's right, and have to keep producing the flashlight. So this is why, again, it's also a call to do yogic practices, because once you then experience your nature as truth, you don't go back to forgetting that you're this light. You remember the darkness and you remember your mistakes, at least certain ones. So this RAS, this reticular activating system, projects into the world. And again, we see what we're looking for and negate everything else in a neutral way. So I could say something that could be open to interpretation. You interpret it the way you interpret it and negate everything else. You negate all the other possibilities when you select or you feel a certain way. And again, a lot of that is just wiring and programming based on these beliefs. For instance, if you grew up feeling like people hurt your feelings and don't respect you and don't appreciate you, that's going to be your default stance when anything that's ambiguous that might refer to that comes up. You're going to react as if it's true. And you're going to project that and negate everything else. I'm saying to negate everything else for a reason, which will be clear. And we filter all situations through this perspective. Now, there's a process called myelination. It shows how tendencies become hardwired habits and also how we can change it. This is why there's a thing called neuroplasticity, where we can change our patterns. And that doesn't mean you change your chart. It means you change the negative quality toward the higher quality, which is always there. Every chart has all the potential. And we tend to go down the negative worldly rajasic attachment part because that's the way we are. Once we start to have spiritual experiences and shine flashlights on all these imagined snakes in our life, new grooves are formed. But until we do, there's this myelination. This is why tendencies become hardwired habits. Again, particularly when we're young, by the time we're in our early 20s, we have so many habits and patterns that we just inherited from our childhood. So the more we do something or think something, the deeper it becomes hardwired and habitual. Things like muscle memory, emotion, and thought become anchored in the three brains, particularly down to the reptile brain. Then all it takes is something to trigger that feeling of disrespect. And right away, you run this program, and it's unconscious. You react as if it's real. You're sure it's real. You fight, you argue, do all these things. Maybe you do something different. Maybe you do things to try to get respect and appreciation because you think the person didn't respect you or whatever. You just go through your whole thing, your whole psychological projection. That's what it's called in the psychological terms, projection. But again, this is how karma works, literally in the brain. This is how karma works in the brain. First as an idea, then as an action, okay? And because we've been taking these actions, we're so habituated to take certain actions, the way to understand this in your brain is these paths have formed, these myelination paths. And they're literally like pavement over a road. It's literally like paving a road. So this is why it's hard to start a new habit, but as you do the habit more, the easier it becomes, because before you do it, you're trying to create a new groove in the mind. And it hasn't become myelinated yet. There's no myelination yet on this groove, on this habit. It's like the jungle. So think if you're trying to make a path through the woods and there's no path. The first time you walk it and you're finding the path, there's no traffic yet. There's nothing, the path hasn't been worn yet. But let's say as you're making the path, there's 200 people following the same path. Well, then by the time all 200 people have gone through this path, there's now a path. So when you go back out, you'll have a path to follow because 200 people have now cleared it and it's been myelinated. There's a myelination sheath now that's hardwired. The first time you try a new habit, it's very hard because the pattern wants to go somewhere else. Everything in your being wants to react a certain way. This is why people say, well, you can change your karma, right? Yes, but it's not easy. You're programmed a certain way. It's by no means impossible, and the techniques to do it are really quite easy, and they're quite enjoyable. Again, there's only a few techniques, literally like yoga, meditation, breathing, asanas, devotional practices. They work, and they're great. Doing those things then creates new grooves. And then the more you do it, the more habituated it becomes, and the less you want to do the other thing either because you connect to something that feels good, and that's always rewarded by nature. The thing that's reinforced and that connects us to spirit is always rewarded. So again, this is how it becomes karma, because it'll still rise in your mind, in fact, to the day you die, as a potential to do the bad thing or the wrong thing or the thing that brings pain. But as you develop as you develop good habits and that pathway to a better choice becomes more solid and myelinated in your brain, you won't want to do the difficult thing. It gets harder to do it. You'll still do it sometime. All right? Let's face it. Let's say it's something simple like eating bad food, eating too much food, bad habits, too much food, not enough exercise, chocolate, ice cream, potato chips, you're out of shape, you feel bad. Okay, the reason it's hard to stop doing it is because that groove is well worn. It might be worn from childhood. It might be 50 years. Can you stop? Yes. Let's say that you get really sick and you have to. And this is often what happens with really deep, difficult grooves is we don't change until it almost kills us, right? But you'll change. Let's say smoking is another, all right? And at first it's hard, but by and by it gets easier, easier, easier. Then you start to associate that good feeling as you get better and better at it. You've done this in your life many times in other circumstances. But does that mean that once in a while you're not going to backslide? No. Once in a while you'll do it. Once in a while you're like, you know what? I want a little chocolate ice cream. Okay. But it doesn't destroy your mind or destroy your brain. But the seed of the karma is still there. And by the way, some people don't have the seed of that karma. We don't all have all the seeds. In fact, we have very specific ones. So when I look at an astrology chart, I'm seeing the myelination paths in the person's brain called samskaras in Vedic thought. These have been formed by the person's actions through many lifetimes, and this one, it's the aggregate that is their karma. So again, when you're looking at an astrology chart, you're essentially looking at those deep grooves called samskaras. These are the person's tendencies and habits, are to see it that way, to form beliefs around that way, to project them into the world that way, to want to run this default unconscious program. And again, you look at other things too, because they're in dasha cycles and all that. But this also shows the path to redemption. It also shows the higher possibility. All of it is shown, right? And you have to evaluate things like the planetary dignities and whatnot to see what are the person's tendencies. Are there tendencies to do the difficult thing and damn near kill themselves before they change? Or is the tendency to understand the higher meaning and change more naturally and avoid a lot of pain? But if you want to understand some skaras in Vedic thought, again, some skaras in Vedic thought are almost directly related. I don't want to say are perfectly related, but I would say almost directly related to what we call myelination and those deep grooves in the mind in neuroscience. They pretty much map right over. When you read what myelination is, it's like, yep, these mental habits formed, again, not just in this lifetime, but for many lifetimes, but we pick it up in this lifetime. Okay? So then what happens is we take all this energy and create the world, and we collapse the infinite possibilities of the moment into the particle, into the wave of the present. So if you don't understand quantum physics, it's pretty incredible. So electrons and smaller particles are seemingly everywhere at once on the quantum level. There is no distinction in matter on the quantum level. On the quantum level, this is, before the electrons and molecules arranged in this fashion, they were everywhere at once. Okay? But then the act of intention toward that collapses that infinite wave into a particle. So there's a thing called the double-slit experiment. You can look all this up, where they fired electrons through two slits, and what happened is the electrons formed a pattern much like water. Again, there was a wave. But as soon as they focus their attention on it, the electrons became particles. It makes no sense. It should not work. Scientists have never been able to explain it. So before you start hearing scientists or people say that astrology is not scientific, ask them about quantum physics and ask them to find one quantum physicist who's ever been able to explain it. Okay? Because you want to see people who are confused about the nature of reality, it's the people that have really looked into it on the quantum level. They're much more confused than astrologers, because at least astrologers say things that are true, at least predictive. Quantum physicists are like, this shouldn't happen. We have no idea why this happens. So what happens, though, is that they make a quantum leap into different channels. Again, there's a lot to talk about, and there's nothing in between those regions. So again, it's already gone quite a bit. I don't want to explain everything in quantum physics. I just want to hit the main purposes. But particles make a quantum leap. They're either here, 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 here. They segment into waveforms that we see. These are the ones we can see through the visible light spectrum. But there's all this energy in between that we don't see, which could be dark matter. It could be interdimensions. It's all kinds of stuff that's theorized now. But the important point here is that once we focus our attention on it, it becomes a particle, it becomes a thing rather than a possibility. Okay? So particles are waves until we observe them, then they can be anything or anywhere. Once we observe particles, or once we observe the particle wave, it collapses into, once we observe the wave, it collapses into a particle, okay? So observation and attention forces the particle to appear as something. Then all other possibilities disappear. So this is called the quantum enigma. And this is why I kept saying that your RAS focuses on one thing at the exclusion of anything else. Now, there are all kinds of experiments with this. It's called change blindness. There's a great experiment with monkeys dribbling a basketball that you might want to Google. Monkeys dribbling a basketball, that shows this change blindness and how your RAS will focus on something at the exclusion of everything else. The same thing is what happens when you focus your attention from your mind into situations and you collapse that infinite possibility into something. That infinite possibility becomes a wave of, or I'm sorry, becomes a particle, becomes a thing. Just like that infinite possibility of somebody said something and I wasn't sure what it meant. If your tendency is to say, well, that means they disrespected me and I'm going to fight and give them a hard time, you've just collapsed the infinite possibility into that. Somebody else, the infinite possibility becomes something totally different. Oh, they must really like me. Oh, they must really think I'm great. Oh, they must be dying to give me $10,000. I don't know, whatever it is. So we take this RAS and this way of seeing things and bring it into the world, and on the quantum level, as shown by quantum physics, the infinite possibility of the wave becomes a particle and collapses because of our attention. Again, it doesn't seem to make sense. That's exactly, they've been trying to disprove this now for 100 years, and this is what happens. At the exclusion of everything else, called the quantum enigma. Now, there is a thing called predictable probability. Okay, there's a ratio of probability of certain outcomes. Okay, Einstein famously said God doesn't play dice, but God does play dice. Okay, there's a ratio of probability. It's also called the casino effect, which it goes like this. We know, for instance, in a game of craps, which is rolling dice, we know that the house is going to win, 7 out of 10 times. Okay, it's predictable. We know it. This is why the casino always wins, right? Ultimately. But we also know that 3 out of 10 times somebody's going to win. And there's no way to know which 3 it's going to be. No way to know. It could be this one. It could be the next one. We don't really know. In fact, they could roll 30 winners in a row. But if they roll 30 winners in a row, it's a good possibility that the next 70 will be losers. But we never know where the winners or losers are going to happen. It's called predictable probability, and it's illustrated as the casino effect. And again, I bring this straight back to the astrology chart and karma. Again, you have to understand that this chart is a portrait of karma, of possibilities, of the samskaras and the grooves in the brain, of the habits, and of a person's tendency to collapse the wave of possibility around this, around this notion. But you have to understand something. Even if it's the worst one, and a pretty low possibility would be, let's say 9 out of 10 times. Let's say 9 out of 10 times, they're going to make the wrong choice and a difficult choice and do something that's painful. There's still going to be one time where they don't. One time, they're going to get it right. And they might get it right 3 or 4 or 5 times in a row if there's positive transits, the right dashas, the right influences, and they're going to build up some energy and momentum. So at some point, many points in their life, they're going to get the real juice. They're going to get the real power, the real possibility of this difficult, debilitated Saturn aspecting Jupiter in the first, and the potential difficult vision that it brings about, and the difficulty of just sort of, just take a leap of faith and try and see what happens. Don't worry, it's not going to kill you. Really, trust me, you'll be okay. Promise, you won't die, right? Which is what this could do. Once in a while, a couple times, just maybe because somebody else pulled them along and said, come on, let's go, and they didn't resist. They did it, and they saw it, and it worked. That, as an astrologer and as someone reading astrology charts for a living and all that, this is something that every astrologer, every astrology student, every person learning, studying, and understanding astrology should understand this. The highest possibility is always there, and a person always experiences it at least a few times. And actually, they experience it quite a lot because we experience these planetary energies all the time. You're looking at the chart, you're looking at the casino effect. What's the likely roll of the dice here? What's the likely roll of the dice with this? What is their basic tendency to see this? And you want to explain that. You want to get in and explain, you're likely to see it this way. And sometimes in detriment, it can really hold you back. But other times, there have been times when you did that and you did that, right? This is the highest functioning of that. So you got to make sure to not let that reptile brain cut you off from that higher potential, because your tendency might be to focus too much on that possibility. So when you bring this neuroscientific brain that we project and you understand on the quantum level how things work, you realize, literally how we're taking this preconception, especially using the astrology chart, you can see literally what it is, and how we tend to collapse the wave in a certain way, but based on, again, quantifiable facts. This isn't me making stuff up. Look up the casino effect. It's part of quantum physics now. And this has been learned science and understood now, and again, tested. I mean, and these people, these are quantum physicists. They test and they try to disprove over and over and over again. Their whole method is to disprove. And they've never been able to disprove this stuff. And I'm not even finished. There's a couple more things I want to tell you on the quantum physical level. But it shows that no matter what, there's a probability, there's always going to be some winners. We're always going to get it right at some point, just because that's the nature of reality as well. Again, the reason I started this class, quoting from Parashara, is because we need to remember that Lord Vishnu has come forth as the divine planets, as the 9 planets. These are divine forces of Lord Vishnu. They never stop being that. These are divine forces in every person. Because we may have a tendency to see it that way, and this deep habit to see it that way, and this tendency to collapse situations into, perhaps difficulty or some version of it, even if it's not some terrible thing. Just we have a tendency to bring our stuff with us in very neutral situations that are infinite possible, with infinite possibility. We tend to just keep doing the same thing with it. Once in a while, we don't. Once in a while, because of a great transit or a dasha cycle or something, we just don't do it, and we get the juice. So we always, as astrologers or as students, you need to always remember this. You have to always remember that you're looking at this aggregate of divine possibility. Okay, divine possibility. Now, there's also a thing called entangled particles, where this particle join this particle, they will act simultaneously with each other. Observing one also observes the other. Einstein called this spooky action. Look up Einstein spooky action, you'll see what I'm talking about. This also shows how when two things get joined and entangled, again, quantum entanglement is what it's called in a scientific sense. Quantum entanglement shows that two particles that are involved, you affect one, it affects the other. So this is why it's so important. Again, you can propose this and project this into people as well. When you get tangled up with certain people, it's not so good. So you want to try to stay untangled and watch your entanglements, or get tangled up with good people so that their goodness is your goodness. This is why it's important to get tangled up with gurus and great teachers and great teachings. Because once we start getting energetically entangled with things, and again, your mind is nothing but these neurons and these protons and these photons and this brain working on a quantum level energetically. Again, this is not just metaphysical woo-woo gobbledygook. And there is not a quantum physicist in the world that would say any of this is metaphysical gobbledygook. Okay, the people that say that are actually people that don't understand quantum physics, frankly. Because once you understand quantum physics, you realize that it doesn't take much of a leap. It's a bit of a leap because they're talking about matter. If you're just a pure Westerner and you're just talking about quantum physics on a physical, level, then you might say, well, but you're bringing in consciousness and all. But again, this is why I said at the beginning, when you bring together the qualities of East and West, it's not that hard at all, especially when you see they were saying exactly the same things back in India about consciousness that we now say about quantum physics. Again, like I said with Deepak Chopra comes and walks into these situations and tries to explain stuff like spooky action, quantum entanglement, the casino effect on a metaphysical level. And unfortunately, these nutty quantum physicists, oh, now you're into woo-woo, now this woo-woo, who can prove all that? And Deepak just has to say, well, you haven't experienced, you don't understand consciousness. So it's only woo-woo to someone who doesn't understand it. If you understand it, you get this is perfectly correct. because these synchronicities that happen, and they happen with matter as well, they also happen with energy. So energetically, your entanglements are connecting you to things in ways that you can't observe. So Einstein was searching for the unified field that explained all of this action. Thinkers like John Hagelin proposed that consciousness is the unified field, and very easily, John Hagelin is, he's a quantum physicist and also into Vedic sciences, very powerful guy. You could look him up, Hagelin. He's done a lot and says that the unified field is consciousness itself, which makes sense. That's not a leap of faith at all when you understand Vedic energetics. Read the Upanishads, read anything on yoga, read anything about Sankhya philosophy. It's all about that. So with quantum physics and karma, as was said, predictable probability. There's a ratio of probability of certain outcomes. That's what the chart is. It's the ratio of probability of certain outcomes. We can know for certain why something is happening, but the future outcome will always be up for grabs. This is why people who also want to act like astrology, if it was a perfect science or stuff that I heard people say, if it's perfect, it should predict everything. It should predict the future perfectly. This is simply not true. Okay, first of all, to reduce it to fortune telling is not true, because you always have this quantum reality. We live in a state of quantum flux all the time. We live in a quantum world. And I don't care. Frankly, I just think it's the arrogance of astrologers that would make such claims. We're not God. And astrology shows us definitely why things are happening, and so much about that's absolutely certain. But on the level of, like, for instance, what a person will wind up doing in that quantum moment or what have you, we just don't know. We can predict with a certain probability, but it's not even that important as an astrologer to make the prediction. It's important that they understand these things, that they understand their tendencies and understand how to navigate them. Astrologers must first learn the highest possibility of any situation and then reveal that to a client, right? This is what I was just saying. Understand what's the highest potential of those things and then reveal that. No matter how difficult a particular energy is, at one time or another, we've done it correctly. And it's always possible to do it correctly again, as I said. So a few conclusions. I'm getting around the end of this long presentation. Attention forces intention out of and creates something out of nothing. So attention, intention creates something out of nothing, or forces a result from the unlimited possibilities that exist. So your attention and your intention forces the situation out of nothing. Out of all the possibilities that exist, it's your attention and intention that's creating this moment. That's affirmed by the quantum enigma. Each particular moment, any choice is possible, but within the framework of that moment. Of course, you can't say, well, if everything is possible, why can't you just start riding a horse right now? Well, of course, it's within the framework of that moment. The circumstances of that moment are determined by the past actions. So the circumstances of any moment you're involved in are an aggregate of all your past actions. And within that moment, any choice is possible. And the most enlightened choice is always possible. You enter it through becoming present. The probability of one action instead of another is a known ratio on the quantum level and also on the karmic level. Again, I could break this out into some kind of ratio of probability they would do this thing or that thing, but we can always guide to the highest potential based on chart factors, ratio of probability, etc. So the current choice and outcome is framed by what we're focusing on. So manage your focus, manage your attention. The current choice and outcome is framed by what you're focusing on right now. What are you focusing on? That's determined by that RAS, reticular activating system. And again, that RAS has been formed by this myelination, these patterns, these habits, all that's the deeper grooves of the mind, a lot of them in the reptilian brain down to the physiological level. So however you're focusing that brain, that's what your current choice and outcome is going to revolve around. Affecting one thing with our attention also energetically affects something else that is entangled with it. Again, we can see this, we can see this everywhere. our energies and emotions affect our loved ones. They don't even have to be next to us. They can feel it. This is why it's so important to surround with, with gurus and great teachers. Our limiting beliefs are controlling us from a very deep level, from the Ras and the three brains. Understanding these three brains and gunas is key to unraveling the higher dimensions of consciousness and presence. So we're being controlled from a very deep level because that reptile brain, our fears, and our mammal brain of being accepted by people are much more prominent. Astrology factors, natal chart transits, dashas, is showing the aggregate of the past tendencies toward a probable outcome and the potential to focus on the highest possibility. As astrologers, we need to always remember that the highest and best outcome is always a possibility. At first, we have to know what that is and then express that correctly. So astrology is best learned and practiced going deeply into the most important high leverage concepts. When we do that, we can also connect it to other sciences like yoga, Ayurveda, but also to other Western sciences with other legitimate frameworks like I've done. So, I'm gonna put this in the I'm gonna put this in the comments so you can download that. But here's again, if you want to understand the, wait a minute, sorry. Okay, so if you want to understand the nature of, if you want to learn about this, you could certainly, download the, you could download a course on this. And, a few people here have gotten the course. They've heard it before. They've gotten it as part of the certification course. And, it's definitely something that will shift your thinking about how the brain works, how astrology interacts with the brain on the neuroscientific level. Again, I really scratched the surface here. I don't know how long I was talking, but I really scratched the surface here. It's very deep subjects, and I hope you enjoyed this this presentation. And it's been kind of long, and I'm just going to let it go there. And I'll put a link in the comments so that you can download this PowerPoint. So you can download the PowerPoint presentation here. And that will allow you to have it with you too and go over it. So thank you for coming, Lynette. I love seeing you here, Lynette. And I see Kenti Ra. I'm glad to see you're here and that others have really enjoyed this. So it's my pleasure to present it. This is the stuff I love to think about. I love to take astrology and all these Vedic sciences and show them in other contexts. Again, like I said, especially because too often those who practice Eastern energetics, that could even be yoga, Ayurveda, Jyotish, sometimes there's too much belief in it all. Like they just kind of believe it all. It's fine, but it really becomes landed when you link it up with other legitimate sciences, and especially Western sciences, because like I said, you want to see where sciences are rigorously tested, and they don't just believe stuff, man. They're skeptics. They're looking for the stuff to stop working. They're conduct all kinds of experiments. There's a whole lot of stuff I didn't go into, like change blindness, which is huge, and especially as it relates to the brain, and all of our cognitive biases, where we just keep seeking affirmation, and our brain is really skewed. And again, I talk about a lot of these things in that course that I linked to. And this is seeing how the brain works and not understanding how the brain works, but trying to do astrology is very difficult. Again, it's kind of hard to understand. And I think it's why a lot of astrologers just tend to bypass. It's a lot of spiritual bypassing and judgment. Well, this is coming up and it's going to be hard, but just pray to God. And, you know, like without understanding like the language of the brain and how the brain is actually working and the parts of the brain that the planets are showing, what part of that brain, what is the motivation for this thing? What is that inner conflict based on? Right? What part of the brain and consciousness and awareness is getting, you know, sort of misjumbled here? You know, we wind up loving people that hurt us. It's a hard thing. The hurt, we want to be protected. That's the tamasic reptile brain, but we love them. That's the sattvic brain. It's a huge inner conflict, or, you know, whatever. And so if we don't understand how the brain works, we don't really know we don't really know how to approach it from a structure or from a framework. So that's why I explore these things and look for other sciences and look for the real wisdom in their approach. And then I can see how it links up directly with Vedic astrology. So it was also, so again, it was also my pleasure, you know, to share this with you. I definitely like teaching this. And I hope you enjoyed this. So take care.